So this week is still an introduction to the book of Revelation. You know, some books you can just start at verse 1 and that's fine, but this is the kind of book where you kind of have to do a bit of practice before you get on the field, so to speak. So last week we talked about the big themes of the letter, what it's really about. It's about worship and allegiance, right? That worship belongs to God and not to any other forces that might demand our worship. It's about the reality of evil and also that God is going to defeat evil. Here, let me share my screen and we can get these slides up. So yeah, it's Revelation is about revealing, right? So pulling back the curtain, seeing what the forces of evil really are and what they're up to. And then conquering and suffering, the idea of being victorious and yet seeing that victory is not always the way that we would expect, but it comes, in fact, in some sense through suffering, right? And Jesus is the example of this. He's called the slaughtered lamb throughout the book. And so he's our picture of what conquering looks like. And so then we also talked last week about how is that message presented and looking at the genres of the book of Revelation. It's an apocalypse, which is a genre of literature that was kind of popular during the time, kind of, I'd say about 200 years before the turn of the birth of Christ, and then for a little bit after. But there's not much of it in the Bible, and so it's not something we're used to. And it's a genre that, again, it's the word apocalypse means to reveal, right? And so it's showing you what's really going on. And showing how God is going to act. And it uses a lot of symbolic language to do that. And then Revelation also, John describes it often as prophecy. But as I've talked about before, prophecy is not just about predicting the future. It's more saying, here's what God is doing, what God is up to, where things are going, and here's how you should live into that. Right? You can be on the right side of where it's going or on the wrong side. And if you're on the wrong side, it may not go well. So it can both comfort if you're experiencing persecution or difficult things, but it can challenge if you're not living up to God's standards of justice and righteousness and all those sort of things. So it's an apocalypse, it's a prophecy, and it's also a letter. We're going to see this next week once we start getting into the beginning of the book, but it is a letter to 7 churches in Asia Minor, or modern day Turkey, in the 1st century. And so that shapes how we read it today, right? It's written to them and it's still for us. And so that helps us avoid a lot of the tendencies that certain interpreters take of thinking it's all about us and what's happening in our day. But when we see it as a letter, it has to start with, what did this mean to the first people who read it and heard it? And then from there, we can figure out, okay, how is it relevant to us? So any questions about those first couple of things that we talked about last week? We're going back a little bit to last week's discussion, but I want to give you a chance just to say anything. You may have to unmute yourselves. I haven't muted everybody yet, but yeah, if you ever have questions or comments, just let me know and we'll talk about those. All right, well, today then we're going to look at the third aspect to our introduction, which is, okay, we've seen what the message is, how it's presented, how do we understand that message, and talk about different methods of interpreting Revelation, because there are a lot of different ones, and they all kind of have their strengths and weaknesses. I would say some are weaker than others, and I'll at least show you, here's the way that I'm going to be looking at this book, and as we go through this study, here's the method that we're going to try and use. So, got a fun chart here. This comes from a book called Reading Revelation Responsibly, a great little guide to looking at this book. And so we're going to look at different approaches to Revelation kind of on this graph. On one axis, you see you can focus on the past, the present, or the future, which that's pretty obvious, right? Is it all talking about things that happened long ago? Is it all about things that are happening in the future sometime or somewhere in between? And then the other axis, got to explain a little more. At the bottom, you see you can read the text as a code, right? The Revelation is a code for the end times. And so the strategy is to decode it, figure out what does this code represent, who is this person in modern times that it's talking about, and decipher those things. And the goal is to figure out what corresponds to what, right? Babylon is this country, right? It's kind of one for one. But then on the other end, looking at the top, thinking of the text as a lens, it's more about thinking in analogies, right? This thing is like that thing, that it's not one for one. It's seeing how is this thing that Revelation talks about similar to what happens now? How is it similar to what's happened in the past and in between? And in some ways, like actualizing it, making that happen, seeing that happen in our time. Let me turn mine down. So again, that's kind of seems a little strange, but as we start looking at some of these different methods, we'll see how that fits in. So 4 methods that we're going to talk about today. The first one is the futurist or predictive model of interpreting Revelation, right? So you see that the number 1 down there on the bottom right. So it's future focus, and it reads the text as a code. Everybody see how this graph is working? So this would be things like the Left Behind series of books and movies, the Schofield Reference Bible, which was a popular reference Bible a couple hundred years ago that really started a lot of this end times sort of theology. Dispensationalists, this is where they would read this, read Revelation. The positive of this way of reading it is that it does make it very relevant, right? That you're looking for signs and this is all happening now, right? So let's figure out what the code is and interpret all these things. But I would also say that this futurist reading is the most problematic because we can just look and see that the past is littered with failed attempts to read Revelation as prediction. That this is where it really is saying, you know, this book is about this person and these historical events that are happening in my lifetime. It's kind of self-centered, right? To think, well, we're the ones that finally got this right and figured out the code, and we finally figured out the dates and times when Jesus is going to come back, even though everybody else before me has failed. You know, I'm smarter than all of them, so I figured it out. Or to say, like, yeah, for 2,000 years of Christian history, this book was really just irrelevant, and it's talking about things in our day. Both of those, I think, do a disservice to everyone who's gone before us, including the original audience, right? This future focus kind of ignores them completely. They just wrote it down so that we could read it when it applies to us and talks about our situation. And so an example, we'll look at this idea of Babylon, right? That's a big character or element to the book of Revelation. We'll see how each of these different methods would interpret what Babylon is, right? So in this futurist predictive model, Babylon is just some new superpower that's coming, right? Like the UN or the EU that becomes a modern Roman Empire. And that's all it ever has meant, is it's talking about this thing that's about to happen. All right. Any questions about that model, the futurist perspective there? All right. So the next one, number 2, my slides will go, is the historical model. Another word, nerd word is preterist, which just means past tense. So this would be in the bottom left. So it's past focused, but still reading it as a code. So in this reading, it's only about the original audience, the original context. It assumes that everything in Revelation has already happened, or in some cases, even that certain things ended up not happening. Right. So the positive is it is very grounded in the original audience, but the negative is it's really not relevant to us. This is just a way that John was trying to interpret the events in his day, and that's about all that it meant. And so in this example, Babylon equals Rome, the Roman Empire, and that's all that Babylon is. It was just the Roman Empire, and it doesn't mean anything more than that. All right, so you don't hear that as much, but that is a view that's out there. The third view, you call it poetic or non-historical. We're seeing this is number 3 here. It's in the middle. So it's kind of focused on the present, and it is reading it more just as a lens, not as a code. And so in this method, Revelation is giving just sort of timeless truths about, the struggle between good and evil, about God overcoming evil. And so it's just kind of allegories. It doesn't really connect to anything that's actually happening in real life. It's just kind of a general story of God defeating evil. And so, the positive would be that it can speak to everybody in all times, because there's always evil that God is hopefully working against. And yet it, again, ignores the original audience, and it just kind of makes it all too general. I have to believe that John was trying to say something a little more specific than just, evil's around and God's doing something about it. That's true, but I think it says more than that as well. And so the fourth method, the one that we're going to use, is calling it pastoral or prophetic. And we see it starts on the left with in the past, but then it's not limited to that. I think the best interpretive method, it doesn't just stay on one point in the chart. And so the way we're going to look at this is that the original context, who John was writing to, that's kind of like our anchor point, right? We start there, and yet we can move a little bit from that as long as we stay anchored to the original audience and what John intended. So it's not just about the past, but it doesn't ignore the past either. And so there's a symbolic meaning, right? It's on the top half of the graph where it's about a lens rather than a code. So these symbols that we see have continuing relevance, right? We'll talk more in a minute about the difference between symbols and codes. But I would say it's more about showing a pattern, right? Things that have happened in the past, things that happen now, and things that have happened in between, and probably will happen more in the future. There's a pattern in Revelation that we see over and over. And there's still a future focus, right? Unless you believe that evil has finally been dealt with already, there's still things that God needs to do. I think we could probably all agree that there's things that God still needs to set right in the world. And so that's why it's still looking to the future as well. So in this example, Babylon represents Rome. In some sense, it represents America, and it represents every empire or powerful nation in between those times, right? Some more than others, and some in different ways, but we can see that symbol of Babylon, it resonates throughout history. So those are the four methods. Like I said, we're going to focus on the fourth. I think number one is the most common, but the most problematic, and that's the one I'm going to reject most of the time. But those are different methods. And as you hear different people talk about Revelation, you can kind of try and figure out, okay, where are they coming from? What's their method of interpreting it? Everybody interprets. The biggest problem is when you think you're just reading it and not interpreting it somehow. But Revelation, more than any other book, it has to be interpreted because it's strange, but I think it is still relevant to us. Okay, any questions about this whole method here?
Yes.
Yeah, Bonnie?
I did not write down number one.
Oh, okay.
Method.
The futurist perspective.
Futuristic.
Yeah, so that's the one that's all about prediction, and it's all about, it's a code, right? So Babylon is this country, the beast is this specific historical figure, and it's usually thinking it's something that's about to happen, and it's focused on our time. So I'd say it's often a little self-centered, right? Because it's, well, if Jesus is coming back, obviously he's going to do it in my lifetime because I'm that important, right? When you say it like that, it sounds pretty silly, but that tends to be how a lot of people read things. They look at the world around them and say, yo, things are so bad now, Jesus has to come back soon. And hey, listen, I totally understand that perspective. I feel that sometimes. But to see that there's been a lot of Christian history, and things have often been not great. And we still see God working, but it's not just limited to our moment. All right, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, we'll stop this for a second. So as we get to this idea of understanding things in a symbolic way, I want to talk about this little exercise that we maybe some of you got to look at this week. So I don't know if people saw this already. I think it's in the chat. You could access it on Facebook. I'll share my screen in just a second so we can look at it as well. But the idea of things being literal or symbolic. And I've got here, I think 20 different examples. of pictures in Revelation? Do these images depict things as they literally exist, or does it communicate truth metaphorically? So just kind of look over that list. I'll just give you a minute or two, because hopefully some of you looked at it already. And we'll just share a little bit. Which ones do you think are literal? Which ones do you think are symbolic? If you went through a number, wrote it all out, how many of each did you get? So things like Jesus is a slaughtered lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. Is that literal? Is that symbolic? Jesus will return on a white horse, wearing multiple crowns and a bloody robe, and strike down nations with the sword of his mouth. Is that literal or symbolic? So just take a second and look over those things, and then we'll talk about what we think. All right, so who wants to share? What was one that you think, yeah, that's literally how it is? Or what's one that's obviously has to be symbolic? Anyone go ahead. Anybody? Is Jesus literally a slaughtered lamb with horns?
I don't recall reading about the 7-headed dragon that tried to eat Jesus in the nativity stories that I've read.
Yeah, we forgot that at Christmas, but yeah.
We might have forgotten that in the last nativity play.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that is not literal.
Okay. But what does that mean, right? What do you think it was trying to say, saying there was a dragon trying to devour Jesus when he was born?
Could it mean Herod?
Okay, yeah, we see Herod trying to kill him, and somehow connected to the bigger evil that's behind Herod. Okay, someone else, just pick another one. What do you think would be obviously symbolic, which seemed like maybe that literally is what is happening or is going to happen?
Well, number 1 would be symbolic. Okay.
Yeah, again, we're going to see that next week, right? He's got a sword in his mouth and yet he's talking, right? If that were literally true, it's kind of hard to talk with a sword coming out of your mouth.
Painful.
So yeah, and some of these things, they kind of break down even and seem silly when you try and take them literally, even if you just try and draw them, right? We'll look at that some through the series of people that have tried to illustrate some of these things, and it's just kind of funny if you try and take it in that way. And yet, we'll talk about what is being represented by that, right? The sword in his mouth. I think that's a powerful image about his word of judgment that Jesus speaks.
Getting really hot. Sorry?
I think one, as I've heard, as I've done this with other people, where it talks about where is it? Number 3 or number 2, right? God sits on a throne in heaven. We tend to think, well, yeah, that's literally true. Because we see that all through Scripture. God's throne is a consistent theme, not just in Revelation. And yet at the same time, if we really took that literally, what would that mean? That would mean what? God has a body. God has a bottom that's in that chair. How big is that chair? Even that, I think, in some sense, is not totally literal. It's a symbol of God's authority, power. That God is like a king. Heather, you had a comment? Your hand raised. So.
Yeah, I was just looking at the list as you're screen sharing. I'm thinking probably numbers 12 through 15 all seem like they're probably symbolic to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's
ones that like literally can't happen.
Images,
seated on the water, sword in mouth,
mm-hmm.
never lying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Honestly, my take on this, I would say pretty much all of them are symbolic. Now, some some seem more bizarre in their imagery than others. And the idea of like us standing before the throne for judgment, maybe that is pretty close to what will actually happen someday. And yet, I think it's not wrong to say they're all symbolic in some sense. And it being a symbol is not a bad thing. And that doesn't mean that we should take it any less seriously. So that's where I want to go next. Talking about what do we mean by symbolism. So let me share my screen again. We'll go back to our slides here. So we want to talk first about the difference between symbol and code. Now, codes are one for one, right? This means only this one thing. And symbols and codes are different, right? Though a traffic signal, for example, is basically like a code. Red means stop. That's not up for interpretation. If you run a red light and then try and interpret that red light as meaning something else in traffic court, it's probably not going to work, right? That is one for one. So a red light is a code that means stop. But a symbol is a little bit more than that. It's not trying to hide the truth. It's trying to reveal the truth on a deeper level, right? So that's why we talk about Jesus as a slaughtered lamb, right? Not because he literally was a mammal with a slit throat, but because he's fulfilling this picture of self-sacrifice, because he is meek, right, and humble, and not what you would expect from the king of all the earth. One writer whose name literally is Eugene Boring, which is pretty amazing. He says, John used symbols in order to communicate that which cannot be expressed in any other way, not to conceal something that could be said more straightforwardly, right? That's what a code does, is trying to hide something until you know how to decode it. But it's just kind of, you could say it straightforwardly, but you're trying to hide it for some reason. Symbols don't do that. They're communicating something even more deeply. Instead of just saying Jesus is humble, Jesus is meek, Jesus gives himself in self-sacrifice, you can say Jesus is a slaughtered lamb, and that communicates that in a different way. We want to avoid turning poetry into prose when possible, because that sometimes destroys its power. Now, as we go through it, obviously we want to try and understand what is he trying to say here, but sometimes if it's poetic, it just kind of has to, you can't interpret everything that it means. Symbols also communicate multiple messages depending on your perspective, right? And that's what we saw as we looked at kind of our method of interpreting things. The symbol of Babylon can mean a lot of different things depending on where you're at in history or where you are in the world right now. And so they have this, I would say they're more powerful because they mean more than one thing. Contrary to those who want to limit this is just a code, and then the number of the beast is talking about this one person. Although I would say I think that's one case where the 666 number is talking about a specific person, but it's someone in the past in the Roman Empire. So that one's not as relevant. So see, when it is a code, it tends to not be relevant for very many people. So there's this idea that seems to be in the air that I hear a lot, that if it's symbolic, then you're not taking it very seriously. And if I take it literally, then I'm taking it more seriously than you are. I don't think there's any reason to think that. Saying something is symbolic, we're still saying that it comes from God. We're still saying that it's true. We're just talking about in what sense it is true, right? And that's an important distinction to make, to understand what something is trying to say. It's not just saying something is literal or saying I take everything literally doesn't mean you're better at interpreting. In fact, I think a lot of times that means you're not interpreting as clearly. The word literal itself, originally that meant reading something according to its genre of literature, right? What kind of literature is this? That's how you read it literally or literarily. And in fact, those who claim that they're taking things literally in Revelation, they often aren't actually. So for example, there's a passage, we saw it in that sheet, where it talks about these locusts that have long hair and armor. Some have interpreted that to say, well, that's talking about helicopters, right? It's a modern 21st century image. That's not taking that literally. If it's literal, then they actually are giant locusts, not helicopters. You're just reading a symbol as a code in that way, right? So even the way that people use the word literal sometimes, they're not actually doing what they say they're doing. And so when we say that they're symbols, I think we're being more honest to what they are and how they work. And we're still finding ways that they're relevant to us without having to go to this simplistic kind of code reading. All right, any questions or comments on all that? We're doing on time. Okay. And again, this is setting things up. We'll see this more as we look at some of these symbols in the coming weeks of, okay, how can we understand this? Why is reading this in a symbolic way more helpful to us? All right, so as we finish up here, the last little thing we want to talk about is just some of the basics of who, when, and where, the authorship, the setting. So first of all, who is John the Revelator? Now, traditionally, it's associated with John the Apostle, the author of the fourth gospel. But we don't see any stylistic connections between the Gospels and Revelation. You expect there to be a little bit of overlap, right? You read the Gospel of John and the letters of John, those are very clearly the same author because of the way that both of those talk. And yet we don't really see much overlap with Revelation. You see he calls himself a prophet consistently through the book, but he doesn't call himself an apostle. And in fact, there's a place in chapter 21 where John talks about the apostles as a group, but it doesn't sound like he's part of that group. So he's definitely Jewish because he knows the scriptures very well. And as I mentioned last week, he alludes to them all the time without directly quoting them. And so we don't know for sure. It could be the same John. It could be a different John. And I think there's a little more evidence that it's a different John. But he doesn't come out and say straightforward. It says that he's exiled to Patmos, which is an island off the coast of where that he's writing to. And so he's clearly known to these churches. So he's probably could be from that area, in fact. But that's about all we know as far as who John the Revelator is. The date, probably we don't know for sure, but many commentators assume that it's around the year 96 during the reign of Domitian. He was one of the Roman emperors who was pretty terrible. He was responsible for a good deal of persecution. It seems pretty clear that Revelation is set after the year AD 70, when the Roman Empire came into Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And so it's probably picking up on some of that, those events that had happened. And so then it would be a little bit later during that time. We'll talk more about reasons for that later as well. So the context, right? Why is he writing, and what is he trying to address for the people that he's writing to? There's clearly some context of persecution, but also I would say some of assimilation, right? Now we know from history that there wasn't this like empire-wide policy against Christians until quite a bit later. I think in the second, maybe even the 3rd century. Now, so at this point, really, it's like the Roman Empire didn't really know what to do with Christians, and so in some places they were harsh with them. Sometimes they ignored them. We see that sometimes persecution would break out for a little bit, and then it would settle down. But there wasn't this like policy across the entire empire yet. One of the big moments of persecution that happened in the early church was in the mid-60s under the Emperor Nero. He famously burned Rome, and then he blamed Christians for that fire that he had started. It was during this persecution that both Peter and Paul were executed by the Roman Empire. And so we're going to see Nero, even though it's past his time and he's supposedly dead, he's still kind of a figure that looms in history as someone who did terrible things to Christians. And yet, even though there has been some persecution, a lot of times the real problem is assimilation, right? That Christians are actually kind of comfortable with the Roman Empire. They don't mind what Rome is doing as long as they can be comfortable. Maybe some of them are even benefiting from it. Again, we're thinking of people who their whole life they've been a part of Roman Empire and pagan religion, and so it's I believe in Jesus, but Rome's not that bad. I'm still going to do these sacrifices or go to these places or eat these certain things. So I think Revelation is also trying to work and challenge those Christians. And I think that's where this book is also really relevant to us, that often is the easier temptation for us, or the more common problem that Christians will just maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally give in to other powers and not live out the way of Jesus like we're called to. And so that's why we see this book is, you'll see this very clearly in these letters to the 7 churches at the beginning, that there's encouragement for some of them, but also a lot of, hey, you need to get back to your first love. You need to cut some of these things out. Right? So it's both this comfort and challenge, very much in the tradition of biblical prophets. So John is doing the same thing here. So, all right, it's a lot of information. Next week, we'll actually get to the book itself. Any final questions or comments as we're wrapping up here? I think I muted everyone, so you can unmute yourself or ask me to unmute if you need to. Anything else before we close? All right. Well, I hope this has been enough to keep you interested as we look at this book. Again, I think it is going to be really interesting and hopefully relevant somehow to our experience today. But ultimately, it's about seeing what God, what Christ, what they are doing even now in the midst of a world that's often dark to bring victory for us and unveiling that victory.